Welcome. I am Jane Bolts, co-regional coordinator of the Southwest region of the Jane Austen Society of North America, coming to you from Southern California. Our speaker this morning is Farah Heron, author of Kamila Knows Best. There's the book, which has been described by Publishers Weekly as a vibrant depiction of the South Asian community in Ontario, Canada, and an endearing cast led by a Bollywood-loving hero and a fashionista heroine set Heron's retelling of Austen's Emma apart from the pack. After a childhood raised on Bollywood, Monty Python, and Jane Austen, Farah Heron wove complicated story arcs and uplifting happily ever afters in her daydreams while pursuing careers in human resources and psychology. She started writing down those stories a few years ago and never looked back. She writes romantic comedies and women's fiction full of huge South Asian families, delectable food, and most importantly, brown people falling stupidly in love. She lives in Toronto with her husband and 2 children. Farah Heron has published 3 other novels. Kamila Knows Best was published this past March by Forever and was named a Best Book of the Year by NPR and Vulture. It is my pleasure to introduce Farah Heron. Let me make her the co-host so she can
oh, here it is.
Okay, have you done that? Okay, great. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, great, wonderful. That was such an amazing welcome. And it's very weird to hear my bio read out because I sometimes forget that that's all me. But I'm really, really excited to talk to you. I literally squealed with glee when I got the email asking to speak to a Jane Austen group, because I feel like that's come full circle, that my love for Austen is now actually paying off and I get to talk to people about it. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Let's see. I don't know what just happened.
Great.
What can you guys see on the screen?
We see you're sharing your screen.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to be, can you just see my presentation or can you see all my notes as well?
No.
Just the presentation. Perfect. That's exactly what I want. So you're gonna see me looking back and forth because I've got my notes and my presentation on 2 different screens. So I'm gonna be looking back and forth, but I'm just gonna jump right into it. I cannot see the chat, so if there's something important that somebody needs to tell me, just go ahead and interrupt. If any of the board members interrupt me.
Thought it was something else.
And I'm just going to get into it. So I called my presentation My Jane Austen World because I'm going to be going back into all of my influences for writing this book, all the way back to when I was just a wee little child.
What, honey?
Can you get the speaker?
You need to mute.
Is that us?
Okay.
Talking. No. We don't.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, just nod is fine. I can see you. Okay. So a bit about me. As Jane mentioned, I am a writer from Toronto. I was born and raised here in Toronto. I live here now. I'm a rom-com writer, so I've written 4 books, 3 adult contemporary rom-coms, and then 1 YA teen contemporary rom-com. And then I have 2 more books, 1 adult and 1 YA that will be out in 2023. I started writing in 2016. I'm currently a full-time novelist, and I do have contracted books expected until 2025. So I will be doing this for a while. I have been doing it for a few years, and I will continue to have books coming out at least until 2025. My first book was The Chai Factor. That's the orange one. It came out in 2019. Then Accidentally Engaged in 2021. Tahira and Bloom came out in 2021 as well. And then finally, Kamila Knows Best, the book I'm talking to you about today, came out in 2022. Next year, I have 2 releases. The first one will be How to Win a Breakup, which is another YA romance. It'll be out in January. And then Jana Goes Wild will be out in 2023. So here's a little video. I made this TikTok a long time ago. It's gonna loop again. So it says, then always reading everywhere. And then now writing my own books available everywhere. So there's a particular reason why I added this little video to this presentation today, because I have a very strong memory of when that picture was taken of me in the back of my dad's car reading a book. I was about 12 years old. My parents were having a garage sale, and I was sitting there waiting for people to show up. It was very empty. We didn't have a lot of customers coming. So I was sitting in the back of my dad's car reading all day. In that picture, I am reading a Judy Blume book, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, and rereading it because, of course, I'd already read it before. I was about 12 years old. But later that day, I picked up another book, which was Pride and Prejudice. So that picture isn't a picture of me reading Pride and Prejudice for the first time, but it was taken the day that I started reading it. My mother gave me her copy. So that was my first introduction to Jane Austen. So I first read Pride and Prejudice when I was 12. She gave me her copy. It wasn't one that we were trying to sell in the garage sale or anything like that. It was her own copy. I still have it. Over the next few years and over my teen years, I continued to read Jane Austen's books. When I ran out of them, my mother gave me a copy of Wuthering Heights, thinking that maybe if she likes Austen, she'll like Bronte. My mother was wrong. I read about 2 chapters of Wuthering Heights before I could not handle it anymore and went back to Pride and Prejudice and read that again instead. So over my teen years, so not like all at the same time, but I spread them out over my teen years. I ended up reading all of the Jane Austen books. And I continued to read and reread them pretty regularly until I went to university. When I was in university, this came out. So I did study English and history in university. And I say partially because of my love of Austen. I've always been a reader, so studying English kind of made sense for me. And discovering Austen made my love of historical fiction, reading old books became a thing. So I did sign up to study English and history, hoping to be a teacher. And then, of course, in 1995, the BBC Pride and Prejudice came out, and that was the first time I'd watched Austen on TV. Maybe a year later, I went through a pretty bad period of depression in university, and I was also insomnia. The BBC miniseries became a lifeline for me. I watched it continuously. I would routinely start watching it after 9 o'clock at night and then watch all 5.5 hours before finally going to bed. So I had a pact that as long as I started it before 9, then I would allow myself to start that film. And that's 5.5 hours long. And I would do this daily. I'm not exaggerating that I would watch the entire thing every day. It was a really hard time for me. I wasn't doing well in school. And I know that it was a big change for me to go away to university. And so I really associate that movie still with comfort, with helping me through difficult times. And of course, it's still my favorite adaptation, although I do like others. When I started to recover, I ended up switching my major from English and history, and I switched to psychology. And then I started watching only 1 episode a night instead of watching them all. Okay, so I'm still a Jane Austen fan years later. My daughter's middle name is Jane, just to tell you how much I love Austen. I have a cat named Darcy. I own most TV and movie adaptations, and I do watch them regularly with my daughter, who is now 14 years old and is also a Jane Austen fan. Maybe not as much as her mother, but she's still there with me watching them. She prefers the Keira Knightley adaptation, though, alas. Most of all, my love for romance genre is thanks to Austen. And I say most of all because I now make a living as a romance author, and I wouldn't be me, I wouldn't have this job if it wasn't for my love of Jane Austen. Okay, so the influence of Jane Austen's work is seen in all my stories. Kamila Knows Best is the only real retelling, but all of my stories are inspired by Austen in some way. In my first book, The Chai Factor, it's an enemies to lovers, opposites attract kind of story, similar to Pride and Prejudice. The main character, Amira, is very outspoken, just like Elizabeth Bennet. My next book, Accidentally Engaged, the mother in this book was completely based on Elizabeth's mother, Mrs. Bennet. She's quite preoccupied with her children getting married. She's very overbearing. She's prone to histrionics. So that was definitely an inspiration there. But there's also a complicated sister relationship in Accidentally Engaged that I think is a little bit like the Dashwoods in Sense and Sensibility. And then my next book, Tahira in Bloom, which was my first young adult book. It's a little bit different. Writing for teens is not the same as writing for adults, and I can't necessarily use those same tropes that I love from Austen in books for teenagers. That said, I do think that my love interest, Rowan, is a bit like Darcy. He judges Tahira when he first meets her, and he thinks that she's nothing more than a shallow influencer because when they meet, she's taking pictures for her Instagram. And then she judges his pride, and she believes that he doesn't want her, a city girl in his small town. So as they get to know each other and as they overcome their judgments of each other, they realize that they're a lot more similar than they think. So it wasn't until after I wrote it that I realized how much of a parallel I had done there. And then I say that only the one book is retelling. I don't know if I'm going to write more or write something more influenced, but I have this dream in my head of one day doing a YA, so a teen retelling of Northanger Abbey. I love Northanger Abbey, and I feel like it doesn't get enough love as it should. So I was trying to think about how to tell that story in an adult story, and I discovered that's probably impossible. Catherine is a little bit too young, and naive to make that work as an adult one. So I have this dream of writing a YA one day, but that's just a fantasy. Okay, so now let's get to why we're here, is to talk about Kamila Knows Best, which I have a copy of it right here. So I knew eventually I would want to write an Austen retelling because, as I mentioned, oh, excuse me, sorry, I'm having a technical difficulty here. As I mentioned, I've always loved reading Jane Austen, but I always figured that I would attempt one of my favorites, which is either Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion. And I don't know, I have several reasons, and I'll get into why I chose Emma, but first let's go back to what Jane Austen thought when she was writing it. So she famously said about Emma, right before she released the book, "I'm going to take a heroine whom no one but myself," yes. Okay, are we good to go? Can you guys all hear me? Yep, perfect. Okay. So Jane Austen famously said about Emma while she was writing it, "I'm going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like." So she herself knew that this was going to be a hard character for people to like. And I knew that that would be a problem if I wrote it too. So it never occurred to me to write Emma. Of course, Jane was completely wrong about Emma. So many people loved the character when the book was first released, and the popularity of Emma has only grown in the years since. I think Emma's having a little bit of a moment right now where she's super, super popular. I didn't know that when I started working on this book, but I'm really, really glad how the entire world is kind of re-appreciating this amazing book. Jane Austen, sorry, Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion, I said, are my favorite books, but Emma has actually always been my favorite character. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that I watched the 1995 Pride and Prejudice until I wore out my VHS copy. But I also wore out another VHS tape back then, the 1996 BBC production of Emma with Kate Beckinsale and the charming Mark Strong as Mr. Knightley. I love this adaptation. It's still my favorite. Followed closely, I think, by Clueless, which also came out around the same time when I was in university. I think Clueless is a very, very excellent adaptation because I think the character of Cher is just almost exactly how Emma is in the book. Also, I really love The Clothes and Clueless and Paul Rudd. But I keep coming back to this this Kate Beckinsale adaptation, and it could be because of that difficult time I went through in university around when it came out. So I watched it many times. And then since then, I've seen other Emmas I like. I've just recently watched the new one with Anya Taylor-Joy, and I did enjoy it a lot. I thought it was a visual feast, but I still kept coming back to my favorite there. So when it was time for me to decide to write my own rom-com, I chose Emma because I love the character so much, because it was always a character that stayed in my head. She's headstrong, she's fiercely loving of her friends and family. Emma always wanted everyone around her to be as happy as she was, and she was always up for a party. She was a touch clueless, pun totally intended there, and maybe a bit self-satisfied. But I think she had the biggest heart under all of that extraness. And of course, Mr. Knightley is like the swooniest of heroes. He's wise, he's respectable, he's powerful, and he quietly loves Emma despite all of her faults. And I absolutely love that I had the opportunity to bring one of my favorite literary couples to life. Okay, so here's a little, I just added this in here because it's a cute little promo that I did for the book. So Emma versus Kamila Knows Best. I can make the dog move. So Emma is friends to lovers. Kamila Knows Best is also friends to lovers. Everybody loves Emma. Everybody loves Kamila. Mr. Knightley's stern gaze is the focus in Emma, while in Kamila Knows Best, it's all about Rohan and his sexy forearms. Both have parties. Emma has carriages. Kamila Knows Best has dogs. Emma was released 200 years ago, and Kamila Knows Best was released in March. And the dog is saying hello. So Jane read this lovely quote from Publishers Weekly. Both Austinites and movie fans who fondly remember Clueless will be delighted. So the question of the day is not why I chose Emma, but why did I want to write an Austen retelling in the first place? So one of the reasons I knew that I would one day write an Austen retelling is I always felt a deep sense of familiarity with these stories, even though they were published 200 years ago, and even though I have never lived in England and my family is a South Asian Muslim family from Canada, I always felt that these stories were just so relatable and familiar to me. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Toronto, as I mentioned. My parents were immigrants. They moved to Canada from Tanzania in the 70s, right after they were married, but before they had children. So in the 70s, they came from Tanzania, so an East African country. And for those of you who might remember the history of that region back then, in 1972, all Asians were ousted from Uganda by the then leader Idi Amin. And so it wasn't really just Uganda that Asians had to leave in East Africa. The three East African countries, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, in all of them, there was a huge exodus of South Asians leaving that had been living there for generations. We traced my family back in Tanzania into the 1800s. So we'd been there for a very long time, and we were all ousted. So there was a big influx of this community coming from East Africa, from those three countries, and a great huge number of them ended up in Canada. So we are Ismaili Muslims of Indian heritage, specifically Gujarati. The Indian culture was always much stronger than the East African culture, but of course they did meld together in the generations we lived in East Africa. So that small but very close-knit community started in Toronto in the 70s. And my parents were very active in it and very vibrant. They were people in Toronto with them that they had known their whole lives. And they raised their children with them. So we would go to our prayer hall daily when I was growing up, and we would see the same people every day in the prayer hall. My closest friends were people from the community. My parents' friends were my aunties and uncles, even if we weren't related. They would look out for us as much as my parents would. I would be staying at people's houses. Every weekend was a party at somebody else's house. Gossip was rampant in the community, but we were all very supportive of each other. Everybody knew everybody. Mostly everybody knew everybody since childhood, since their whole lives, and including my parents knew people their whole lives, even though they were immigrants in a new world. Doesn't that all sound a lot like an Austen village? So I see some people nodding. It does, right? So before I get into that, this is another promo that I love that my publisher put together. So Kamila Knows Best is for fans of Getting Caught in the Rain, Jane Austen, puppies as social media stars, main characters with style, and Bollywood movie nights. So going back to my Austen Village, so it can be very hard to set Jane Austen stories in the modern world because we don't live in these small communities anymore. We often have several communities. We have our work friends, our family, our college friends. We move homes. We don't stay in the same place for as long. We might move jobs, move cities. So we don't have that community the way that they did 200 years ago. I've often seen retellings, whether Austen or other classical lit, I've often seen them set in specific communities. For example, we talked about Clueless, which is a retelling of Emma set in a California high school. Another recent film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice that I really loved was Fire Island, and that was set in a holiday island near New York City. So it was all set in this small island, which reminded me of an Austen village. And people would come to the same island for their holiday every year. So you knew people, and there were the people that had on the good side of the island and the people on the poorer side of the island. So I thought that was really well adapted. But because I felt like the way I was raised and my background also felt like an Austen village, it made sense for me to one day write that story setting in that kind of a community. It's a small, close-knit group within a big city. The South Asian Muslim community in Kamila Knows Best is in Toronto, but it still feels like a small community where everybody knows each other. Like in Emma, Kamila is constantly around people who have known her whole life. Her parents' friends are like family to her. Everyone is always gossiping and everyone is always in each other's business. And that's quite a bit different from how you would imagine living in such a big city would normally be, but that community is what ties it all together. So for the community is why I'm writing. So here's another cute promo that we had put together. So to tell you a little bit about what is in Kamila Knows Best. So Rohan loves Bollywood rain scenes and he loves wet saris. And stylish and generous Kamila, she's got it all figured out. She loves setting up her friends, but she's not looking for a relationship for herself right now. Kamila Knows Best is based on Emma. It's similar to the Jane Austen classic, but also different. The book also has food, family, amazing supportive friends, and a bonus puppy that will steal your heart. Kamila loves dogs, and her dog Darcy is famous on TikTok. Rohan is buttoned up but very caring. He has forearms to die for, and he's always willing to roll up his sleeves to help Kamila. Kamila Knows Best is a standalone, but there are other Easter eggs from my other books. So another reason why I think that these Austen books were well set in a community like mine is because of the Asian family dynamics. So I'm not going to generalize about all Asian families. I'm talking specifically about my own family and my own community here. So on top of the community structure feeling like an Austen village, I always found that Asian family dynamics were often mirrored what I saw in Austen's world. My own parents weren't nearly as obsessed with marrying off their children as, say, Mrs. Bennet, but I got married relatively young. I was 24. So maybe if I had waited longer, maybe I would have gotten that dinner table conversation about getting married. But I do know other families that were more like that, more encouraging their families. Weddings are a big part of our culture. So a lot of thought and a lot of thinking is about what your wedding will be like and what your marriage will be like. So because many families do put pressure on their unmarried children, I thought it set well in my community. There's also the expectation of children to take care of their parents as they age in Asian families, and that is mirrored in Austen's stories. Not just parents, but also siblings and other family. You are responsible. The family is very close-knit, and everybody's responsible for everybody. And also, as I said before, the way that your family's, the outer circle, not just your family, but your parents' friends, your parents, it's all very close-knit. And I feel that that isn't necessarily as easy to see in modern society, but in many Asian families, that is how the dynamic works. Okay, so of course, the last reason why I absolutely had to write an Austen book was because of the romance. So here's something else that was said about Kamila Knows Best. It's a sweet, slow burn love It's a sweet, slow burn story about a woman who finds herself before finding love. So at the end of the day, I wanted to write an Austen retelling because I am a romance writer. And I know there's some debate whether people can consider Austen's work to be romance by today's definition. But I fell in love with the romance genre because of Jane Austen's book. So if you remember when I had that really embarrassing picture of me sitting in the back of my dad's car when I was 12 years old, I started reading Austen at 12 years old. I also read other romances then too. I probably was already a romance reader before I picked up Austen. I was reading teen romances like mad back then. These were these little short category romances made for teenagers. They were very, very sweet. They were always beautiful white girls. And I read them nonstop. They were low angst. They were amazing. So I was a voracious reader of teen romance until I was not a teenager anymore. So in my 20s, I stopped reading romance altogether. I never read adult romance. I went to university to study English, and I read what I called serious books. Yes, I did buy into that misguided belief that romance is a lesser genre than the others, that it's not serious, that it has less value. I still did reread my Austen books, but other than that, I wasn't a romance reader. In my 30s, I went through another difficult time, similar to the one I went through in university. So at the time, back in university, I had turned to my Austen books. And again, in my 30s, when I was going through this other big difficult time in my life, I turned to my Austen books again. But this time I wanted to branch out a bit because I was reading so much at the time that I went through my Austen books too quickly. So of course, now we're in the era of Google. I Googled what books will give me the same feeling as Austen. And that's when I discovered Regency romance. I had never read one before. I was in my mid-30s by then. I read them a lot. I started reading Tessa Dare and Courtney Milan and just reading those Regency romances like they were going out of style. Then I moved on to contemporary romances. These books really, really helped me cope with that difficult time in my life, just like the Austen adaptations had helped me when I was younger. But I eventually started tracking my reading. And then in 2015, because I had started tracking, I realized that I read 150 books that year. Vast majority of them were romance. So that was in 2015. January 2016, I started writing my own because as I was reading all those stories, they kept going through my head. And I'm like, you know what, now's time to actually start to see what I can make of this. Let's put it down just as fun, just as a hobby. And then of course that was in 2016 and I sold my first book a year later in 2017. So indirectly, I think I can thank Jane Austen for pushing me to start writing. So my way of giving back to Jane was to write my own adaptation. And that's why I knew that I would always do that one day. Okay, so how did I approach writing an Austen retelling? So how did I do that? I still don't know exactly how I did that. First thing I did was I reread the book. I probably could have skipped that step because I knew the story so well, but I still did. I reread Emma. Then I brainstormed character ideas. So who would Emma be today? I knew I was going to set her in my own South Asian Muslim community. So what kind of a person would she be? What would her relationship with her family be like? What would she do for a job? Because I'm writing with modern sensibilities and I really wanted Emma to be a driven businesswoman so that modern readers will respect and relate to her. What would Emma's family be like? What would her father be like? What would her community be like? And then, of course, what would Mr. Knightley be like today? With an Emma adaptation in the background, so now we're going to go back to my to that Emma adaptation from 1996. Wow, that's so long ago. So with that on the background, I started listing the major characters and how I would adapt them to the modern story. Also the major story beats, the plot points that I wanted in my book. And then I carefully plotted the story before I started writing. This whole process was a lot harder than I thought it would be. I assumed that since the plot was all done, this book would be really easy to write, but I was totally wrong. It was very difficult. The biggest difficulty I had was because fiction conventions have changed so much in the last 200 years. The main issue was that Austen's heroines don't really have any external goals the same way that modern heroines are expected to have. If I kept to the main plot, then Kamila would have no forward momentum. She would just have things happening to her instead of her making things happen. And that's something that we expect of our stories now. And of course, I had the same issue that Austen herself had when she said that I'm writing a character that only myself will love, is I knew that people would have difficulty loving Emma. I remember reading different like forums and people talking about Emma and saying, I love Jane Austen except for Emma, I don't like her. People, she's a very polarizing character. Maybe it's because she's so image conscious and because she's preoccupied with everything else and meddling into other people's lives. I love the character for so many reasons. And I wanted the challenge of writing something that would do that character justice. It's funny, I tend to challenge myself, maybe not to my detriment, maybe to my detriment. But I had read a review for another Jane Austen retelling, and it basically, the review, I don't remember what the book was now, but the review did not enjoy it, saying that Emma came across as shallow, as immature and selfish. And I was like, can it be done? Can a modern interpretation of Emma be done without people coming from it thinking of her as shallow or any of those things? So I saw it as a challenge. Okay, so for the major characters, obviously Kamila is my Emma. So she's a CPA. She works in her father's firm. So again, I gave her a job, and I gave her a job that is very intellectually stimulating. She's an accountant. She loves dogs. She volunteers at the animal shelter. So and I made her very philanthropic. She volunteers for many things, and that is partially to overcome that hump of people finding her selfish. She's a very loyal caregiver to her father, who deals with both physical and mental illness. So this is something that was very important to me, to put mental illness on the page in my book. When I reread Emma, it was quite clear to me, I have a background in psychology, it was quite clear to me that Emma's father has an anxiety disorder. So I decided to make it a on the page diagnosed anxiety disorder. And partially that was because it's not something that's talked about a lot in my culture, especially when it comes to older men, and mental health awareness is something that's very important to me. Rohan is my Mr. Knightley. So he's a successful tax lawyer. He's known Kamila his whole life. He helps Kamila care for her father. Rohan and Kamila have become close since his divorce, and Kamila knows she can always count on him. So a major change I made here is I reduced the age gap between them. I think having that 20-year age gap from Emma, I think trying to do that in modern times would be very difficult because I didn't want that power dynamic. 7 years is a lot, especially for two people that grew up together. If you can imagine, when you were 7, a 14-year-old was an adult. So I think that still gave the feeling of an age gap without it being something that'll make people worry about the power dynamic when they're adults. All of Emma's friends are there. Asha is Mrs. Weston, Marisol is Harriet, Dane is Mr. Elton, Anil is Frank Churchill, and most importantly, Jana is Jane Fairfax. Jana is Kamila's secret nemesis. And I really leaned into that plot point and made their relationship nuanced and an explanation for why Kamila has a dislike of Jana. Jana ended up being one of my favorite characters, which is why I decided, after writing this book, which is why I decided to write her own book. So the book that I have coming out next June, Jana Goes Wild, is about this Jana, which was super exciting to me because I got to bring all of these characters into it. So Kamila's in it, Rohan's in it, Kamila's dad's in it. All of the characters are all there. They're all on vacation together, so it's a lot of fun. And it is not necessarily based on any particular Austen, but it is heavily inspired by Persuasion. Okay, so rewriting the story, none of this was easy to do. I maintained the major beats of the story with my characters, but I gave Kamila a different backstory than Emma to bring the story in line with modern storytelling. I'm so happy with the finished book, honestly. I think Kamila Knows Best is my favorite book, and maybe because I love Jane Austen so much. It's my favorite book that I've written. Just like Emma is my favorite Austen character, Kamila is my favorite of my characters. She's incredibly loyal, she's loving, she knows how to have fun, she's 100% unapologetically herself, even when she's feeling insecure. She faces her problems head on and is willing to admit when she screws up, which she does a lot. She is misguided and she can get in her own way, but she has a heart of gold under those perfect dresses and perfect hair. More than any character I've written, I wish Kamila was real because I want to go to one of her parties. I'm not sure, like I said, I'm not sure if I'm going to ever write another Austen retelling, another retelling as faithful as this one, but I'm still thinking about that YA Northanger Abbey. But I'm so super glad that I did write this book and I challenged myself because I think that I myself feel that I have done justice to my beloved Emma. Thank you so much. I would love for you guys to all connect with me. So on Instagram, I'm Farah Heron Author, Twitter, @Farah Heron. My email address is here, and Facebook, I have a Facebook reader group with 2 other Canadian rom-com writers called Northern Heat. And now I'm open for any questions. I'm happy to answer anything about my writing style, my process, even about what other Austen adaptations I enjoyed. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Farah. That was absolutely fascinating. I just loved every bit of it. And you're talking about your background. It really made everything come alive. Thank you very much. I'm going to apologize for my technical failings. I said I was going to mute everybody beforehand. I did not, but everybody did it themselves. So thank you. I'm going to hand the Q&A over to Leah. So Leah, please unmute yourself. And Leah will coordinate the question and answers. Leah.
Hello, I'm Leah.
Hi, Leah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And so the first question we have here is, does Jenna Goes Wild continue the story of Jenna from Kamila Knows Best? And you just answer that.
It does. It picks up the story several years later, though, so it's not immediate, which it's been a bit of a challenge. I don't want to give away too much of Kamila if you haven't read it, but anyone who has read Kamila will know what's going on in Jenna's life, and then to pick it up several years later, you can kind of guess what the story is going to be about. But it's actually super fun because it is, this is a bit of a spoiler, but it is set during a destination wedding, and it's actually Kamila's wedding. So that's really fun to be able to write years later what Kamila's wedding would be like. And you can imagine it's over the top. It's insane.
Thank you. That's a good spoiler, actually. All right, next question. Oops, and let me copy and paste it so everyone can see it. Okay, Kamila Knows Best is very visual. Kamila's skirt with the puppies, the puppy prom, Kamila's home, all described so we can see them. When you read Austen, do you see the stories unfold in front of you? In your own writing, do you visualize the action and then write what you see?
So when I read Austen, I'm not sure. I mentioned a lot of film adaptations there because I do love to watch film adaptations of any Austen work. So it's hard for me to go back to before I ever watched a film adaptation. So when I'm reading it now, I'm seeing Colin Firth. When I'm reading Pride and Prejudice, or when I'm reading Emma, I'm seeing Kate Beckinsale. So it's hard for me to separate because I've been watching those things forever, for so long. I'm not a very visual writer, though. It's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine last night, and she's a very visual writer. When she writes a scene, she sees everything. She sees where the light is hitting that plant in the corner. She sees what everybody's wearing. She all the senses are all, and she sees it all in her head as a stage. She says it's like a stage set in front of her, and then she writes the story. I am the opposite. All I know is the dialogue. I write, my first drafts are almost dialogue only, and then I pepper in everything as I go. Kamila is a very visual person, and I knew that she was going to be larger than life in the way she dressed, the way she decorated her home, and all of that. But it all came in more drafts and more drafts. I added a throw cushion with every draft. Her clothes changed to suit the environment that she was in at the time. So I do tend to go through a lot of drafts when I write a book. So my first drafts, no, not at all. They're not visual at all. But as I go, I add more and add more and add more.
Okay, thank you for that. That actually was really helpful. All right, next question. You mentioned that there are Easter eggs from your other books in Kamila Knows Best. Is there a best order to read your book so we can understand the Easter eggs better? Published order or different order?
Probably published order. The Easter eggs in Kamila Knows Best are super, super minor, and they're not something that you'll necessarily catch. So I don't make anything easy for me, but I don't write in like a series, whatever. I know some romance authors will have this nice long series and all the books are connected. So my first book, Chai Factor, and my second book, Accidentally Engaged, those two books are very closely connected. They're about two best friends. Chai Factor is about Amira, Accidentally Engaged is about Rena. So those two books are definitely connected. And then I wrote Kamila Knows Best, and it is strongly connected with my next book, which will be Jana Goes Wild. So those two books super close together. After Jana Goes Wild, so now we're talking way into 2024, I'm writing a book that is now connected to the last two. So it's connected to Chai Factor and Accidentally Engaged. Instead of the logical thing would be to have written that book before, but no. So not necessarily, so you can read them in order that I publish them, but it's not necessary at all. Any of the books, even the ones that I'm saying are closely connected, you don't have to read. I'm very conscious of making sure that any book can stand on its own. There's nothing you're missing. If you haven't read Kamila Knows Best and you pick up Jana Goes Wild next year, you will have missed how Kamila and Rohan fell in love, but you will still see them getting married. And it really, anything that you would have needed to know, you will have been told. So you can keep them all. You can read them separately, or you can read them in the order that they've been published.
And I see someone popped in. Why puppies? I.e., why did there need to be something like this, a social media hobby? Do the puppies have any analogous feature in Austen's Emma?
I don't even remember why. I think it was puppies, and also the time of year was something that I was thinking about things that you do in the fall. I knew the book was going to be set in the fall. And I was thinking about things that are comforting, walking your dog, going to parks and things like that. So it was more an aesthetic. And then the puppies just kind of exploded and it became a much bigger part of the story as I went. This is the thing that I do is I walk outside, I'm like, oh, look at that dog in the leaves. I should put that scene in my book. And then all of a sudden the dog is the main character of the book instead of just being a small thing. When I was researching the book, so actually, I wrote most of the first draft of Kamila Knows Best. I wrote most of it in the very first few months of the pandemic. So if you guys will all remember back that time when we didn't know what was going on, there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know when we could leave the house. We didn't know how this virus was transmitted. And it was a very scary time. And I was writing the story about parties and dogs and about doing all the things that we couldn't do anymore. And it was a very hard time to be writing that particular book. But a lot of the things that I wished we could do and I wasn't sure if we'd be able to, I just put it in there. So lots of get-togethers and those fun things. But right before the pandemic, I was researching the book and I went to an animal shelter for research, just to figure out what these big shelters are like, because I'd only ever been to small ones, so I wanted to see what a really large animal shelter would be like. And at that animal shelter, they had in the front room, they had a front room with a big glass window on one side, and there was a brand new litter of lab puppies in there, and they're all black except for one brown puppy, and they're all sleeping. And I took pictures of those lab puppies because it was the cutest thing I'd ever seen. And that's where Potato came from, the dog in the book. So Potato was a real dog that I'd seen in the animal shelter. And it was literally a week later that everything was shut down. The whole city was shut down. So it was kind of like that was the last time I went out. So it kind of became, I wasn't able to do any more research. So the dogs became a bigger part of the story when I started writing it.
And so I know we're heading to the last 10 minutes and I had some private messages for questions. So I'll have those first. Is there a way to get an autographed copy of your book?
Of Kamila, you can get signed copies through a bookstore called Queen Books in Toronto. I believe they still have a couple of signed copies left. Other than that, and they do ship, so you can just call them up and ask them if they have copies. I was there yesterday and they had copies. Other than that, no, not right now. That's it, just Queen Books. I don't have a way to, I don't sell them myself. So it's just when I happen to be in an event. And I don't have any events outside of Canada for the next little bit.
Okay, next question. Thank you so much for this presentation. You mentioned a bit about your family history, and I find it fascinating that you can trace your family's roots all the way to the 1800s. Do you think you would consider writing a book based upon your family history?
That's an excellent question. I have never actually thought about that. And the main reason is I only very recently learned that I had the ancestors that came from India to Tanzania in the 1800s. Diaspora communities, Asian communities, there's not a lot of written history. There's not a lot of place for me to research. It's all stories told. And a lot of those stories, because we've migrated 2 major migrations, a lot of those stories are lost. I wouldn't even know who to ask. It's something that it's the reason why I don't write historical. I love reading historical books, but I don't write them because the research is so daunting to me. I prefer writing something that's set where I can research it easily just by going places. But that's something I've been thinking about what it was like when my family first came to Tanzania. I know that they came in these like tiny little boats called dhows that were, and I think that would be a very interesting story to think about what that would have been like for them back then.
All right, next question. Was there anything you had hoped to incorporate from Emma or from your own imagination into Kamila Knows Best, but couldn't quite make work? In other words, did you have to kill your darlings? Any character you had to leave out, etc.?
Yes and no. I think I had wanted, I think the one character I wish I had more about is Mrs. Bates' character. So that would be Rashida Suleiman. I wish I'd added more of her in it, just because I always find her like funny and in Emma and a nice. So maybe that. I don't think there was any real darlings that I killed. If anything, I intentionally left things out. I'm not a very sentimental writer. Like if I write a few scenes and my editor's like, those aren't working, I'm like, yep, delete them all. Goodbye. I don't grow very attached to it. I'm very much progress. Like if the book is working, it's working. If it's not, it's not. And I have this mental trick that I do on myself is I never actually delete anything. So it's all still there on my computer. So it's just not in the finished book, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore. It's all still there.
And looks like this might be the last question. I love Accidentally Engage as much as Kamila Knows Best. Nadim's background is similar to your family's. Are there any other similarities in that particular book?
Yes, thank you for saying that. I love Accidentally Engaged too. Yeah, Accidentally Engaged has a lot of me in it. I think I say that book is Rena is probably the most like me to any of the characters I've written. I'm also obsessed with food, and definitely I used to bake bread every 2 days. I tend to go into everything head first. So when I started baking bread, it was to keep 3 sourdough starters and bake every 2 days. And so that character, her little obsessive nature with food is definitely me. Rena's parents are not my parents, but at the same time, still very close knit, similar to Rena's family. I also have a complicated relationship with my sister, the way Rena does. So I think that book is the most me in it, but not completely. Nothing. I mean, it's fiction, so it's just fun.
Okay, so we're about to finish, and I know someone asked again about the film you mentioned before. So I have here in the link to Fire Island on Hulu. And I think that's about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Farah. We really loved it. It was fascinating. I'm going to read your other books, and I look forward to your book about your personal history, your personal story. That would be fascinating.
You guys have inspired me. I'm going to start doing some research.
Great. Now I know some of you, we had some link problems and getting into this. And so fortunately, this has been recorded. And so it will be up on our Jasna Southwest YouTube. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Farah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful.